Alright everyone, welcome to Blue Lock Power Scaling 101, and this will be the first and last class in session. Today, I will be putting you all into Blue Lock Power Scaling, which will basically be me explaining the power system and the power scaling and how to power scale for Blue Lock in this one video. Because, well, if I'm gonna be frankly honest, I feel like if people are gonna watch my videos, I want them to know how my mind works and how I do things as well. And I would also want to help them maybe fix their criteria or add something to their own criteria or do something basically similar to this. This is basically just to help people out there that don't really understand Blue Lock scaling yet and are trying to get into it and just need help to understand, right? So, what we will be talking about first is not the power scaling itself, but the power system. Now, in Blue Lock, the power system works in a way of egos and resolutions and resolves in themselves, right? Now, what I mean by this is usually awakenings will happen when pressure and frustration meet or confidence or motivation meet, right? And these could be different kind of combinations for a different level of skill ceilings. But usually the Blue Locker's powers and levels are connected to their visual prowess or their ocular presence, right? So what I mean by this is if you watched our Red Blue Lock, you will clearly be able to see that usually when something is happening to them, their eyes change in some way, shape, or form. Now, I just like to break this down to the most simplest and complex matters, right? So the first level of this said power scaling or power system is flow, which is pretty simple but also pretty complex because there's different levels of flow. You have the lowest level, which is considered instinct, which is more reacting instinctually to the ball, which the visual cue for that is players' eyes going completely black. We've seen this with Nagi, Ren, Isagi, players like that. And another higher level of this state is flow in its actual self, which is a more crystallized version, which is a more complete version. It's a more consistent form of scaling for flow characters since all of them seem to have that eye and it seems to always perform better than the black version state of that eye, right? And the problem with Blue Lock's power scaling, I will say, I will critique it for a moment, is that Kenshiro does not specify what most of these actually do. So we kind of just have to rule it out as it just improves the player's like sense of play and skills and maybe their individual abilities. We can kind of just rule it down to that, especially because the fact that they do just seemingly go up a level every time they do access for one of these abilities. So I think we could just come to that with that line of reasoning that that's just the case. I mean, we have to just infer something because Kenshiro doesn't give us a lot to go off on besides that they just get better with these power-ups, right? Now, going further, we have things like Metavision and Predator's Eye we get introduced to, which are amplifiers that amp certain categories of these players' individual abilities. So for Predator's Eye, it allows a player to lock on one specific spot and be able to just tunnel vision it. And it helps with hitting very sharp shots, and it helps with locking onto the ball to stop plays, just like how Ren does in the New Eagles League. And Kaiser demonstrates to us various times of how to use Predator's Eye offensively. Same thing with Barrow. And the other one is Metavision, which we see that Isagi uses all the time. And he is the one who introduced this to us, an ability which takes all the information in the field and uses it, essentially makes you a god of the field if you can utilize it at a world-class level. It's a world-class ability. And Isagi states that the chapter we get the actual reveal and talk about it, it's a world-class ability that can take you to the highest realm. So we already have asserted all of these abilities and power-ups that all of these characters get. There is one that isn't correlated to ocular vision, but it is Reflex X Reflex. That is one that has been consistently something that's up there. We see Sai and Shido do it, which no one can really counter it. And then we see Sagi and Hiyori and Shido and Charles do it, which again, no one can counter it. It's so good that it's the baseline for the end of the Neo Eagles League. So that's just saying so much in itself. Somebody that has that technique and can do that technique and reproduce it would be immediately a problem or a force to be reckoned with, which is why Hiyori is such a problem because he can just do this on a whim, right? So now that we've done talking about the power scaling, or sorry, now that we're done talking about the power system and how it kind of essentially works, to help you wrap your heads around that. But what you guys are really here for is the power scaling and how you probably should power scale some of these characters and treat them. So let's get right into it. So let's start off with first, let's separate the abilities from the performance. I'd like to say this should always be your first rule. A player having a better weapon doesn't automatically make them a better player. Uh, Clear as day, we have characters like Rayo who arguably have the best weapon in this series, but regardless, he does not always have the feats or the required scaling to put himself on a higher level than people who might have a weaker weapon but have better showings with that weaker weapon than he does with a stronger ability, right? So that's what you just want to do. You never want to have a character higher on a list because simply their ability is better. You should always put their performance or their feats above that. Second, individual abilities, or what we would like to call them, the individual talent of our players. Now you would like to break these players into an individual group when you're most likely talking about them in an individual mindset, as if this player is better than this player on a individual set. So that's taking teammates and other factors out of the equation and just simply talking about their individual abilities as a player. I think this is really good when we're talking about strikers, because their value usually comes from their individual abilities as a player of scoring goals or changing the pace to 0 to 1 on the scoreboard. I think it's great for that. Now, in other cases, I think it's good to put these players in team scenarios like midfielders who can contribute to the game on a more broader level. And the same thing can be said for defenders as well, even though, defenders aren't really talked about in power scaling debates that much. Now, 3, going back to weapons. This is a very important thing, even though I just said that you shouldn't put it over individual abilities or how they perform. It is still very important. Weapons do play a very big part in power scaling because you have to take account into a character's kit when you are comparing them to other characters and how they perform on a general basis, right? Now, what I mean by this is, for example, let's talk about how Ren's weapons in his kit make him one of the most strongest offensive duelists in the series, right? Now, the reason why this is because his kit allows him to dribble past players easily by just the fact that his destroyer dueling is pretty insane. One of the most insane abilities that we've seen so far be showcased, right? And why I'm bringing this up is because this is important for us power scaling, because in a 1v1 or a duel, that gives him the advantage. Now, for Ren, in this case, why it's different from the first example, when I brought up the first rule, is the fact that Ren in this case has the feats to back up that duelist weapon. Like, he has the prominent feats to back up this already OP weapon, which makes him so impressive, right? Now, that's just a little bit on Rule 3. Now, Rule 4, guys. Pay close attention to this one. Feats. Feats are very important, and feats should always outweigh the assumptions of power scaling. What I mean by assumptions is, and what I love to always bring up, is the size scaling. Now, with size scaling, a lot of size scaling is built upon assumptions and statements with very big implications, right? Now, with this, I always say that it's always skeptic a little bit with Psy, and feats are always more definitive in a way than how you would go about scaling Psy with his narrative scaling and just how big most of his things are. So if I was to give this one an example, like I have done the rest of the rules, it would just be simply saying Kaiser, somebody like Kaiser who has more definitive feats would be viewed upon a little higher than somebody like Psy who has good feats, but his things that bring him extremely high in the verse are vague and can be played skeptic on, which it's really hard to prove these things, your interpretation, depending on how you can argue for it. Now, next is consistency. Now, the biggest problem with blue lockers is that they are usually not always consistent, which is a big problem with their power scaling. We have characters like Nagi who have really big moments and they have really good peaks, but they're not very consistent, so we cannot label them as a good player when we're comparing them to characters that consistently perform good. So that's why characters like 5-stage Revolver Nagi have to be scaled in his own entity, because you can't scale Nagi in the New Eagles League just with him as a total, because he's not consistent, so he'd always lose. So you have to give him that edge in these debates, right? Because you have to argue, is this character consistently better than Nagi at his peak? Which is a fair debate for Nagi, since he's sorry the rest of the New Eagles League besides that point. Next is that context always matters. Now, when you're looking at scans and you're trying to figure out your arguments, your metas, I want you to always know there's probably deep subtext that lets you either help your interpretation or it might hurt your interpretation, which can be good for you either way, because it can help you strengthen your argument or take a different way in your argument to counteract counter arguments, right? Now, match context is a big thing in Blue Lock, because, you know, you have things like fatigue and implications that characters aren't even trying, or if they are trying, things like that, which are very, very important when you have to determine scaling another character relative to another character, which, you know, would either be upscale or downscale. Now, a very big thing that I talk about on this channel a lot as well is narrative versus actual definitive scaling. Now, narrative scaling is more how the implications of the story kind of scale and upscale a character. Prime example is Sai, a character that hasn't played in over 200 chapters, but is supposedly one of the top players in the series. Now, a more definitive scaling of this is, again, a character like Kaiser or Hugo, who has more of a definitive of plane where they stand at right now, because they have feats and they've played in the current game with the current players. While Sai, on the other hand, played with way weaker players and still lost, but he does have statements that implicate that he should be around the same level of the Blue Lockers that we are seeing right now, which can be put into question very much. Which I always think that if you're going to put narrative over real scaling, you have to have real good evidence that points to your conclusion and your verdict, right? I just think that's normal logic, right? Also, just want to say that matchup scaling will not always be fair. In some cases, not every scaling battle is linear. Sometimes there's always different situations and different scenarios that can lead to different conclusions that might not always give you a straight answer to who wins. The best example I can give is my Kaiser versus Hugo video, where I said Kaiser would still be able to probably score on Hugo once or twice, but Hugo would eventually end up triumphing in the end because he's just better, and he would be able to lead to a suitable victory eventually before Kaiser can keep doing the impossible against him. That's just a very short explanation. Of course, I would go to my video for a deeper explanation, but I would honestly say so far I pretty much talked about everything and covered everything. I mean, if I missed something, please very much enlighten me in the comments. I would appreciate that. Again, this was for people that are new or people that just wanted to learn more about Blue Lock, if anything, or just my subscribers that wanted to know how my brain works and I'm power scaling for the most part. This is mainly my criteria for how I work. Sometimes it can change, sometimes it varies, but this is what works for me for the most part. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you made it to this point, I would appreciate a like and a sub, and I appreciate you guys. Thanks. Have a great day, and peace.